Picture this a grand throne room bathed in golden light, hushed whispers cutting through the air like blades. At the center, two figures stand locked in a battle of wills, each word dripping with venom, each glance a silent challenge. This isn't just a clash of personalities, it's a fight for power, legacy, and survival. Welcome to the world of throne room confrontations, where the stakes were life or death, and every exchange could rewrite history. From the glittering courts of Europe to the opulent mansions of Gilded Age heiresses, these explosive face-offs were more than just dramatic spectacle, they were calculated moves in a high-stakes game. Imagine Queen Elizabeth I, her voice steady but her eyes burning, silencing a rebellious noble with a single sentence, or Vanderbilt heiress Alva Belmont staring down a room full of skeptics, her defiance echoing off marble walls. These moments weren't just about pride, they were about control, and behind every hissed insult or icy glare lay secrets, scandals, and strategies that would shape empires and fortunes. But what made these confrontations so electrifying? Was it the sheer audacity of speaking truth to power, or the razor-thin line between triumph and ruin? In this video, we'll pull back the velvet curtain on history's most unforgettable showdowns, the whispered threats, the public humiliations, the alliances shattered in an instant. You'll witness the raw nerve of monarchs who refused to bow and socialites who played the game better than kings. This is where legends were made and where reputations crumbled. So settle in, because the throne room awaits, and its stories are more thrilling than any fiction. Throne room confrontations weren't just arguments, they were theatrical battles where every word, every pause, even the slightest shift in posture could tip the scales of power. Unlike private disputes hidden behind closed doors, these clashes unfolded under the watchful eyes of courtiers, servants, and rivals, turning every insult into a public spectacle. The stakes far higher than personal pride. A misstep could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse, history is littered with nobles who gambled and lost everything in these high-stakes verbal duels. Take, for example, the infamous showdown between Queen Elizabeth I and the Earl of Essex. When Essex stormed into her private chambers uninvited, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a direct challenge to her authority. The throne room forced these conflicts into the open, where symbolism mattered as much as substance. A monarch's raised eyebrow could silence a room, while a subject's defiant tone might spark whispers of treason. Protocol was a weapon, and those who mastered it, like Catherine de Medici, who wielded silence like a dagger, could dismantle opponents without uttering a single threat. Yet what truly set these confrontations apart were the unspoken rules everyone pretended to follow, until someone didn't. In private, a noble might rage and scheme, but in the throne room, even fury had to be wrapped in polished eloquence. That's why Marie Antoinette's icy dismissal of starving protesters, "Let them eat cake," became legendary. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a catastrophic breach of the expected script. Royalty was supposed to perform compassion, even when they felt none. The moment those norms shattered, the facade of power crumbled with it, and then there were the Gilded Age heiresses, who transplanted these battles to ballrooms and boardrooms. When Alva Vanderbilt publicly humiliated her husband for infidelity by divorcing him mid-scandal, she wasn't just airing dirty laundry, she was rewriting society's rules in real time. Like queens of old, these women understood that spectacle was power. The throne room might have gilded ceilings instead of corporate offices, but the game remained the same: dominate the narrative or be dominated by it. So whether in a palace or a parlor, these confrontations thrived on contradiction. They demanded formal restraint, yet rewarded explosive defiance. They were meticulously staged, yet their most legendary moments came when someone tore up the script. And that tension between control and chaos is what made them unforgettable. The throne room wasn't just a stage for nobles and rivals to clash. Some of history's most explosive confrontations unfolded between kings and the very institutions meant to crown them. Take the bitter feud between Henry II of England and Thomas Becket, the archbishop who dared defy him. At first, they were allies. Henry even appointed Becket to the church's highest office, expecting loyalty. But when Becket took his spiritual duty seriously, defending the church's independence against the king's demands, their friendship shattered into a holy war. The throne room became a battleground where royal decrees collided with divine authority, and the stakes were nothing less than who truly ruled, the man who wore the crown or the man who anointed it. Henry's rage was legendary. In a moment of fury, he reportedly cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Words that may as well have been a death warrant. Days later, knights loyal to the king stormed Canterbury Cathedral, swords drawn, and cut Becket down at the altar. The murder shocked Christendom, turning a political spat into a martyrdom that humiliated Henry and forced him to crawl barefoot through the streets in penance. Here was the brutal truth. Even kings couldn't escape the consequences of crossing sacred lines. The church might not have armies, but it held something far more dangerous: the power to legitimize or destroy a ruler's very right to reign. This wasn't just an English drama. Across Europe, monarchs and popes waged silent wars over taxes, land, and the right to appoint bishops. When Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV defied Pope Gregory VII, the Pope retaliated with the ultimate weapon: excommunication. Overnight, Henry found himself stripped of divine sanction, his subjects freed from their oaths of loyalty. Desperate, he crossed the Alps in winter, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside Cannes Castle, begging forgiveness. It was a stunning reversal. The most powerful man in Europe brought to his knees by a priest's decree. Yet the church didn't always win. Philip the Fair of France, armed with lawyers and spies, outmaneuvered Pope Boniface VIII, engineering his arrest and humiliation. The message was clear: the kings could play dirty too. These battles weren't just about theology, they were about cold, hard control. Taxes poured into church coffers, bishops held vast lands, and monarchs craved that wealth and influence for themselves. Every confrontation, whether with whispers or swords, was a test of who truly held the reins of power. Would the crown bow to the cross, or would the throne bend faith to its will? And let's not forget the women who navigated these minefields. Helena of Aquitaine, twice a queen, knew better than to openly defy the church, but she masterfully exploited its factions, using pilgrimages and patronage to build alliances, even as her husbands clashed with clergy. The throne room might have been dominated by men, but the game was far more nuanced. What made these power plays so gripping was their impossibility. Both sides needed each other, even as they plotted mutual destruction. Kings required the church's blessing to rule, but the church relied on royal protection to survive. It was a dance of mutual sabotage, where every embrace hid a knife. And when the balance tipped too far, like Becket's blood staining the cathedral floor, the repercussions echoed for centuries. These weren't just arguments, they were tectonic shifts in the very idea of power. Elizabeth I wielded words like scalpels, precise, lethal, and impossible to ignore. Her infamous temper wasn't just a personality quirk, it was a calculated instrument of power, sharpened by years of survival in a court where one misstep could mean treason charges. Take a decades-long duel with Mary, Queen of Scots, a clash dripping with biblical stakes. Cousins by blood, rivals by destiny, their feud was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Elizabeth's letters to Mary were velvet-wrapped daggers, polite on the surface, laced with menace. Kings do not sit safe upon thrones while rivals live, she once hinted, a chilling reminder that Mary's claim to England's crown made her a walking target. Yet Elizabeth hesitated, spinning out Mary's imprisonment for 19 years, turning a castle cell into a gilded cage. Why? Because execution would martyr a fellow queen, but delay let doubt fester, proof that sometimes the deadliest weapon was patience. Then there was the Earl of Essex, the handsome favourite who mistook indulgence for weakness. Their final confrontation exposed the heart of Elizabeth's wrath, betrayal. When Essex burst into her bedchamber unannounced, seeing her without her wig or crown, stripped of the Virgin Queen's myth, it was more than rudeness. It was an assault on the carefully crafted sovereignty she'd spent a lifetime building. Her retaliation was brutal. Essex, once the toast of London, found himself humiliated in a public trial, then marched to the scaffold. Elizabeth signed his death warrant with cold fury, but legend claims she wept afterward. That duality defined her, the monarch who could condemn a man with a flourish of her pen, yet still mourn the loss of a soul who'd forgotten she was first, always, a queen. What made Elizabeth's anger so terrifying was its unpredictability. She could reduce ambassadors to stammering wrecks with a single glacial silence, then pivot to warm laughter to keep allies guessing. When the Spanish Armada threatened England, she didn't cower. She armored herself in rhetoric, rallying troops at Tilbury with a speech that still echoes. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king. The message was clear. Her temper wasn't petty rage, but the fire that forged empires, and woe to those who mistook her gender for gentleness, yet even her fury had purpose. Every outburst, every calculated silence, reinforced a sacred truth. The crown was not just war, and it was performed. When Mary of Scots finally faced the executioner's axe, Elizabeth's horrified reaction, whether genuine or political theatre, served notice. Regicide was a sin, even when necessary. She made her courtiers complicit in every decision, binding them to shared guilt. That was the genius of her wrath. It wasn't just punishment, it was pedagogy. Each confrontation taught the same lesson. Loyalty wasn't optional, and disrespect wouldn't just cost a title or lands, it would rewrite your epitaph. Elizabeth's reign proved that in the throne room, words could bleed a man dry long before the axe fell, and her legend endures because she understood something modern leaders still grapple with. True power isn't just about being feared. It's about making sure they never know what you'll do next. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he orchestrated it like a grand opera, with Versailles as his stage and every nobler player in his meticulously scripted drama. The Hall of Mirrors wasn't just a dazzling architectural feat, it was a psychological battleground. Picture this, 1,000 flickering candles reflected endlessly in those gilded mirrors, multiplying the king's presence until it felt inescapable. Here, Louis turned humiliation into high art. When the arrogant Duc de Lauzun dared to court the king's cousin in secret, Louis didn't banish him, he crushed him with silence. For 8 agonizing years, Lauzun lingered at court, stripped of titles, but forced to attend every glittering event, a living cautionary tale. The message was clear, disgrace wasn't banishment. It was having to watch your rivals bask in royal favor while you faded into the wallpaper. But Louis' genius lay in his unpredictability. One moment, he could shower a courtier with honors. The next, he'd freeze them out with a single glacial glance. Take the infamous affair of Nicolas Fouquet, the finance minister who hosted a feast so extravagant it outshone the king's own. Louis didn't rage publicly, he waited. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested mid-council meeting, dragged off to life imprisonment. The lesson, grandeur was the king's exclusive right. Even flattery could be treason if it upstaged the Sun King's radiance. And then there was the weapon of etiquette. Louis transformed simple acts like handing him his shirt at the morning levee into coveted privileges, turning nobility into groveling supplicants. The Comte de Gramont once arrived late to a royal hunt, only to find Louis had ordered every gate locked, forcing him to scale walls like a common thief. The king's smirk said it all. Punctuality wasn't courtesy, it was obedience, yet beneath the glitter, these theatrics served a ruthless purpose. By keeping nobles scrambling for favor, Louis drained their regional power, centering France's destiny on his person. When the Fronde Rebellion nearly toppled his childhood reign, he learned that control wasn't just about armies, it was about monopolizing attention. Versailles became a gilded cage where aristocrats willingly surrendered their independence for the mere chance to bask in his shadow. The brilliance of Louis' confrontations, they left no bloodstains on the parquet. His coldest punishments were psychological. The Duke exiled not to a dungeon, but to his own crumbling estate. The Marquise granted an audience only to be addressed in monosyllables. In the Sun King's court, the cruelest sentence wasn't death, it was irrelevance, and that's why his system endured long after his death. He didn't just break rebellions. He broke spirits. Maria Theresa of Austria faced a crisis no ruler should ever endure just weeks after her father's death. A pack of wolves circled her throne. Prussia's Frederick the Great saw her as weak, a young woman unprepared to defend her birthright. He invaded Silesia without warning, sparking a war that would test her claim with fire and steel. But Frederick underestimated her. When he offered cynical negotiations, expecting her to fold, Maria Theresa responded with a thunderous refusal that echoed across Europe. I would rather dig ditches than surrender my rights. It wasn't just defiance, it was a masterstroke of political theater. In one sentence, she transformed herself from a grieving daughter into a warrior queen, rallying a fractured empire to her side. Theirs was a battle of contrasts. Frederick wielded cold pragmatism, mocking her as that woman in his letters, certain that emotion would be her downfall. But Maria Theresa turned passion into strategy. When she addressed the Hungarian Diet in 1741, heavily pregnant and dressed in mourning black, she didn't beg, she commanded. The Hungarians, long hostile to Habsburg rule, rose in a standing ovation, pledging, "Our lives and blood for your majesty." Frederick had cannons, she had something far more dangerous, a cause. Yet the true brilliance of her resistance lay in her adaptability. After years of bloodshed, when Austria couldn't reclaim Silesia by force, she pivoted. The 7 Years' War saw her forge alliances with old enemies like France, cornering Frederick in a vice of her making. Their bitter correspondence during this period reads like a duel fought with ink instead of swords. He accused her of motherly obstinacy, an insult she wore as a badge of honor. Her retort, "A sovereign's duty is to fight for their people, not their pride." Even in defeat, Maria Theresa rewrote the rules. Though she never regained Silesia, she secured her dynasty's future through ruthless marital diplomacy, marrying her children into Europe's great houses. When Frederick sneered that she was more prolific than victorious, he missed the point. Her ultimate triumph wasn't on battlefields, but in nurseries and marriage contracts, ensuring Habsburg blood would endure long after Prussia's ambitions crumbled. Theirs was a feud that redefined power. Frederick won territory, but Maria Theresa won history. She proved that a ruler's fiercest weapon wasn't just armies, but the will to turn every setback into a new front in the war. And in the end, while Frederick's Prussia faded, her descendants still sat on thrones when the 20th century dawned. That's the irony of their clash. The so-called weak woman outmaneuvered the great king where it mattered most, time itself. Catherine the Great didn't wait for power to be handed to her. She seized it with the precision of a general and the flair of a born performer. The morning of June 28, 1762, began like any other in the Russian court, until whispers spread like wildfire that Empress Catherine had vanished from the palace. By midday, the truth exploded into the open. She wasn't fleeing. She was marching at the head of an army, her loyalists rallying behind her as she declared herself the sole sovereign of Russia. The throne room, usually a stage for carefully scripted ceremonies, became the backdrop for one of history's most audacious power grabs. Peter III never saw it coming. Just 6 months into his disastrous reign, he had alienated nearly every faction, mocking orthodox traditions, withdrawing troops mid-war to please his Prussian idol Frederick the Great, even publicly humiliating Catherine at state banquets. But his fatal mistake was underestimating his wife. While he dismissed her as a bookish outsider, Catherine had spent years cultivating allies, military officers, clergy, even her own lovers, transforming resentment toward Peter into a web of conspiracy. When she rode into St. Petersburg in her signature crimson uniform, the people didn't just accept her coup, they cheered it. The confrontation itself was a masterclass in political theater. Peter, holed up in a country estate, initially thought it was a joke. By the time reality struck, his guards had defected, his ministers had bent the knee, and Catherine's manifesto declaring his overthrow was being read in every public square. His abdication letter, scrawled in panic, was a pathetic surrender. "I beg your majesty to pardon me. I ask only a pension and my violin." The man who'd once sneered at Russian customs now begged for mercy in broken grammar. But Catherine knew half measures were deadly in Russian politics. Peter couldn't just retire. He had to disappear. 8 days later, he was dead, officially from hemorrhoidal colic, though even contemporaries whispered of assassination. The throne room's lesson was brutal. In empires built on instability, survival required erasing rivals, not just outmaneuvering them. What made Catherine's coup legendary wasn't just its boldness, it was her understanding of spectacle. While other usurpers worked in shadows, she staged hers as a patriotic uprising, framing Peter as a traitor to Russia itself. Her coronation portrait, depicting her in imperial robes with a triumphant smile, sent an unmistakable message: this wasn't a crime. It was a rebirth, and for 34 years she proved it, expanding borders, championing the arts, and ensuring no one ever again doubted who ruled Russia's throne room. Napoleon's temper was a force of nature, as unpredictable as a cannonball and just as destructive. Diplomats who entered his presence braced themselves. One moment, he might dissect their arguments with razor-sharp logic. The next, he'd hurl insults like grenades, reducing seasoned ambassadors to trembling silence. The Russian envoy once compared facing Napoleon to standing before a thunderstorm, where the air itself seemed charged with his fury. His rages weren't just emotional outbursts, they were tactical weapons. When the Austrian negotiator Metternich dared suggest France surrender territories, Napoleon erupted, overturning furniture while screaming, "You forget it is I who make kings." The message was clear: defiance wouldn't just be rebutted, it would be obliterated, yet nothing exposed the paradox of Napoleon's wrath like his divorce from Josephine. Here was the conqueror who'd toppled empires, brought to his knees by personal heartbreak. Their marriage had been scandalous, passionate, and politically astute, Josephine's charm smoothing his rough edges, her connections greasing the wheels of his rise. But when her inability to produce an heir threatened his dynasty, cold calculation clashed with raw emotion. The scene in the throne room that December night in 1809 was theatre of the cruelest kind. Josephine, sobbing uncontrollably, clung to him as he mechanically recited the script of statecraft. The interests of France must come first. Even as he signed the decree, his hands shook, a rare crack in the imperial facade. The aftermath revealed a man torn between two selves, Privately, he flooded Josephine with letters, confessing, "You are woven into my soul." Publicly, he paraded potential brides like chess pieces, ultimately choosing Marie-Louise of Austria to secure a royal bloodline. When she bore him a son, Napoleon wept with relief, dubbing the child King of Rome, in a spectacle meant to erase all doubt, but the ghosts lingered. Years later, exiled on St. Helena, he'd murmured Josephine's name in his sleep, her portrait the last thing he touched before death. What made Napoleon's explosions so revealing was their duality, the way rage and vulnerability intertwined. His tirades weren't just loss of control, they were performances designed to intimidate, to dominate, but with Josephine, the performance failed. In that throne room, the world saw something far more dangerous to absolute power, a man who, for all his conquests, couldn't conquer his own heart. And perhaps that was the ultimate irony, the emperor who reshaped Europe with his will, brought low by the one thing even he couldn't command, love. Queen Victoria's most devastating weapon wasn't a royal decree or a public rebuke, it was the weight of her silence. Imagine the scene, a stiff-backed monarch seated at the head of a gilded table, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the shoulders of the man speaking. The air grew heavier with every passing second of her unbroken quiet. This was how empires trembled. Her infamous clashes with Prime Minister William Gladstone weren't battles of shouted insults or fiery speeches, they were psychological sieges. Gladstone, a titan of oratory who could hold Parliament spellbound for hours, often found himself unraveling under Victoria's wordless disdain. She once described him as a dangerous old fanatic in her diaries, but to his face. Not a syllable. Her refusal to engage became a form of annihilation. The power of Victoria's silence lay in its ambiguity. Unlike her uncle George IV, whose rages were theatrical and fleeting, or Elizabeth I, whose wrath came in precise verbal strikes, Victoria's cold restraint forced others to fill the void with their own fears. During one particularly tense audience with Gladstone over Irish Home Rule, she simply turned her chair slightly away, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed, yet so deliberate it sent a shockwave through the room. Ministers interpreted these silences like priests deciphering omens. Was she bored, displeased, or had they already lost her confidence entirely? The uncertainty was the punishment. Victoria's glacial stares were equally lethal. When Disraeli, her favorite prime minister, playfully flattered her with the title Empress of India, she rewarded him with a rare, warm gaze. But when Gladstone droned on about budgetary reforms, her eyes would glaze over, her attention visibly withdrawing like a tide receding from shore. The effect was corrosive. Aides reported Gladstone leaving these sessions shaken, his famous confidence in tatters. The Queen hadn't argued, she hadn't needed to, her indifference was a verdict. Yet there was method to her muteness. Victoria understood that in constitutional monarchy, where her direct power was curtailed, influence had to be wielded obliquely. By withholding approval, she didn't just express displeasure, she reshaped the political landscape. Gladstone's reforms stalled not because she vetoed them, but because her silence signaled to his own party that the Crown's favour lay elsewhere. It was governance by atmospheric pressure, and Victoria was the barometer. Perhaps her most brutal silence came in 1892, when Gladstone returned as Prime Minister for his fourth term. The Queen, then in her 70s and mourning Albert's death for the third decade, received the news without comment. She didn't refuse to work with him, she simply made every interaction a study in passive resistance. Audiences were cut short, letters went unanswered. When Gladstone arrived for their first meeting, Victoria kept him standing for 20 minutes, her fingers steepled, her gaze resting somewhere above his head. By the time he left office 2 years later, broken by age and her relentless frost, the message was clear: a queen's silence could outlast any politician's career. Victoria's reign proved that words weren't always the sharpest tools in the throne room. Sometimes, the most crushing force was the sound of nothing at all. Edward VII's throne room was less a seat of solemn governance and more a stage for his scandalous theatrics, where mistresses flitted in and out of favour like characters in a risque French farce. But behind the velvet drapes and cigar smoke, his romantic escapades sparked confrontations that blurred the line between bedroom farce and political crisis. Take the infamous clash with Lord Charles Beresford, a naval hero turned furious cuckold. When Edward seduced Beresford's lover, the glamorous Daisy Brooke, the Lord stormed into Marlborough House with a threat that would have been unthinkable against a monarch: a duel. Pistols at dawn, honour at stake, except one doesn't challenge a king to a shootout without consequences. Edward's response was pure theatrical evasion. Rather than address the scandal head-on, he exiled Beresford to the Mediterranean with a sudden naval posting, cloaking the punishment in patriotic duty. But the damage was done. Beresford's wife, furious at the humiliation, leaked Daisy's love letters to the press, igniting a firestorm that even Edward's charm couldn't smother. For weeks, cartoonists lampooned the affair, depicting the king as a bloated Cupid dodging cannon fire. The throne room, usually a sanctum of decorum, became the subject of music hall bawdy songs. Yet Edward's genius lay in his ability to weaponize his own notoriety. While Queen Victoria had wielded silence like a blade, her son mastered the art of distraction. When aristocrats muttered about his latest indiscretion, he'd host a lavish dinner, seating rivals side by side until champagne smoothed their grudges. His mistresses, actresses, aristocrats, even a Rothschild banker's wife were never just lovers. They were pawns in a social chess game, their influence weaving a web of alliances that strengthened his grip on Europe's courts. The Beresford affair wasn't even his most dangerous entanglement. Years later, when the Earl of Aylesford threatened to expose letters between Edward and his own wife, the prince resorted to near blackmail. He enlisted Prime Minister Disraeli to pressure Aylesford into silence, dangling colonial appointments like carrots. The message was clear: Edward's private scandals could derange entire careers. And woe to anyone who forgot it, but beneath the cavalier exterior lurked a paradox. Edward's hedonism made him wildly popular. The public adored their playboy prince, whose appetites mirrored their own rebellious fantasies. While Victoria's court had been a mausoleum of propriety, Edward's reign felt like a raucous house party, one where the host might pocket your wife's glove, but damn if he wouldn't make sure you had another drink first. His confrontations weren't just personal spats. They were a masterclass in turning weakness into spectacle, then spectacle into power, because in the end, no one could outcharm the man who made scandal look like part of the job description. Wilhelm II of Germany didn't just lack diplomacy, he torched it with the subtlety of a cannon salute. Picture this: a British diplomat, carefully chosen for his tact, arrives in Berlin to ease colonial tensions. Within minutes of their audience, the Kaiser erupts into a rant about England's perfidious foreign policy, jabbing a finger so violently his military medals clatter like wind chimes. This wasn't an isolated outburst, it was standard procedure in Wilhelm's throne room, where every meeting risked becoming an international incident. His infamous "Place in the Sun" speech, boasting of Germany's imperial ambitions, wasn't just chest-thumping, it sent chancelleries across Europe scrambling to update their war plans. The deeper irony: Wilhelm craved respect. Fluent in English thanks to his British mother, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, he obsessively sought approval from his royal cousins Edward VII of Britain, Nicholas II of Russia. Yet his attempts at camaraderie backfired spectacularly. During a visit to England, he casually suggested reorganizing the British Army under German command, leaving his hosts too stunned to reply. His letters to Nicholas, filled with overly familiar nicknames and unsolicited military advice, gradually turned the Tsar's patience to ice. Even his own ministers resorted to hiding sensitive reports, knowing Wilhelm's knee-jerk reactions could derail months of careful negotiation. Then came the Daily Telegraph disaster of 1908. In an interview meant to improve Anglo-German relations, Wilhelm managed to insult nearly every major power. The English were mad as March hares for distrusting him, the Japanese yellow peril, the French hysterical. The German press, usually sycophantic, splashed the quotes nationwide. Parliament erupted. Even Wilhelm's staunchest allies cringed. The Kaiser, momentarily chastened, promised restraint, but within months he was boasting to Austro-Hungarian envoys about mobilizing against Serbia, pouring gasoline on the Balkan tinderbox that would eventually ignite World War I. What made Wilhelm's blunders so catastrophic was their timing. Europe's alliances were a house of cards in those years, and his unchecked rhetoric kept rattling the table. When he assured Austria-Hungary of Germany's blank check support against Serbia in 1914, he didn't just back an ally, he handed them a lit match. Later, as armies mobilized, he suddenly panicked, firing off frantic telegrams to Nicholas begging for peace, but the damage was done. The throne room theatrics that once amused courtiers now had body counts. Wilhelm's reign proved a brutal lesson. In the age of telegraphs and newspapers, a monarch's words could echo louder than cannon fire, and when those words were loaded with arrogance, insecurity, and reckless ambition, they didn't just burn bridges, they burned continents. The grand ballrooms of Europe had never seen invaders quite like this, armed not with swords, but with dowries large enough to bankrupt small kingdoms. American heiresses, fresh off Gilded Age fortunes, stormed aristocratic Europe with all the subtlety of a Wall Street tycoon buying up railroads, and no moment captured the collision of old world pomp and new world defiance like Consuelo Vanderbilt's disastrous wedding day. Picture the scene: 19-year-old Consuelo, drowning in lace and misery, her mother Alva's iron grip hidden beneath silk gloves, the Duke of Marlborough, a man who'd once bragged he'd only marry for money, stood stiffly at the altar, already glancing at his pocket watch. As the organ swelled and the assembled nobility leaned in, Consuelo's tears fell unchecked, not the demure droplets expected of a blushing bride, but a flood of quiet rebellion. This wasn't a marriage, it was a hostage negotiation with cathedral decor. The Vanderbilts had paid $2.5 million, nearly $80 million today, to buy their daughter a title, and the Duke got his check. But Consuelo refused to perform. When pressed to vow obedience, her voice cracked. When paraded at receptions, her smile never reached her eyes. The Marlborough House Ball, meant to showcase the union, became a spectacle of glacial tension. Guests whispered about the way she flinched when the Duke touched her elbow, how he'd vanish for hours with his mistress while she buried herself in charity work. Society expected American girls to be dazzled by coronets. Consuelo treated hers like a dog collar, yet the real confrontation came years later, when the facade finally shattered. Discovering the Duke's latest affair, Consuelo didn't retreat to her boudoir with smelling salts. She marched into his study and demanded freedom. Divorce was unthinkable for aristocrats, but this was no ordinary duchess. She'd watched her mother leave an abusive marriage, had seen how American women fought for autonomy. When Marlborough scoffed, she played her trump card, threatening to expose his financial desperation, the very secret that had driven him to marry her. The Duke, who'd once sneered at her colonial manners, suddenly found himself outmaneuvered by a woman who understood that in the Gilded Age, money talked louder than bloodlines. Their split scandalized 2 continents, but Consulo's revenge was sweeter than any gossip. She transformed into a ferocious advocate for women's rights, funding suffrage campaigns, opening schools for working-class girls, even advising Winston Churchill, her former brother-in-law, on social reforms. Meanwhile, the Duke's beloved Blenheim palace crumbled into disrepair, his fortune drained by bad investments. The lesson was clear: Europe's aristocrats might own the titles, but America's daughters wrote their own endings. This was the paradox of the dollar princesses. They were traded like bonds, yet many like Jenny Jerome, who birthed a British Prime Minister, or May Golit, who turned a Portuguese duke into her personal art curator, wielded their wealth like scalpels, dissecting archaic systems from within. Their confrontations weren't just personal, they were cultural revolutions disguised as tea-time tantrums, because while Europe's nobility thought they were buying fresh blood, they'd actually unleashed Trojan horses in Worth gowns. And by the time the old guard realized their mistake, the throne rooms already smelled like Newport seawater and ambition. Alva Belmont didn't just climb the social ladder, she blew it up and rebuilt it in her image, turning Fifth Avenue mansions into battlegrounds where reputations died at the stroke of a guest list. The Vanderbilt name might have been synonymous with railroad millions, but in the cutthroat world of Gilded Age New York, old money still sneered at their new wealth. That is, until Alva decided to rewrite the rules. Her weapon of choice, the most brutal social event of the century, the 1883 costume ball. With surgical precision, Alva excluded Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of society, from her initial invitations. The message was clear: the Vanderbilts didn't need Astor's approval, they would take her crown. For weeks, whispers of the snub swirled through parlors and private clubs. Then, at the 11th hour, Alva relented, sending Astor a perfunctory invite, knowing full well she'd grovel to attend. And grovel she did. The night of the ball, Astor arrived in humble silence, her presence an unspoken surrender. Alva had turned the social order upside down with nothing more than parchment and ink. But her throne room tactics didn't stop at exclusion. When her own marriage to William K. Vanderbilt crumbled over his infidelity, Alva didn't fade into the background like a proper lady of the era. She sued for divorce with the fanfare of a military campaign, leaking salacious details to the press and dragging high society's dirty laundry into the sunlight. Newspapers dubbed it the trial of the century, and Alva leaned into the spectacle, holding court in her marble drawing room while reporters hung on her every word. By the time the dust settled, William's reputation was in tatters, and Alva had something far more valuable than a husband: autonomy. Then came her piece de resistance, the remarriage that stunned 2 continents. At 53, already a grandmother, she wed Oliver Belmont, but not before converting his Newport mansion into a suffragist fortress. Marble House, once a monument to excess, became the headquarters of her war for women's votes. She hosted rallies in its gilded halls, turning the very symbol of patriarchal wealth into a stage for revolution. When critics sneered that she'd abandoned society, Alva shot back, "I have not left the world. I have merely stepped ahead of it." Her most brilliant move, weaponizing her daughter Consulo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. What seemed like a surrender to aristocratic tradition was actually a Trojan horse, using British nobility to fund American feminist causes. While the Duke squandered her dowry, Alva funneled Vanderbilt millions into suffrage campaigns, even bankrolling the National Woman's Party. Every time Consulo appeared in the society pages, dripping in diamonds at yet another royal ball, Alva's money was quietly dismantling the system that had trapped her daughter in gilded misery. Alva's reign proved that in the Gilded Age, The real power wasn't in boardrooms or banks. It was in the velvet-gloved grip of a woman who knew how to make rejection feel like execution and charity smell like revenge. Her throne room wasn't a place of genteel diplomacy. It was a courtroom where she presided as judge, jury, and when necessary executioner, and the verdict was always the same: adapt or perish. Carolina Store's ballroom was a fortress, its gates guarded not by soldiers, but by the unspoken rules of who mattered and who didn't. For decades, she'd reigned as New York's undisputed social empress, her famous 400 list dictating which families were worthy of her gilded world. Then came Mrs. Mary Stuart, a coal heiress with a fortune as dark and volatile as the minds that built it. Stuart didn't knock politely on society's door. She kicked it open with a pair of diamond-studded heels, and the resulting collision would split Manhattan's elite into warring factions. Their first skirmish erupted over something seemingly trivial, the height of a ballroom ceiling. When Stuart built her Fifth Avenue palace in 1879, she flaunted a soaring two-story dance hall, a direct challenge to a store's more modest, tradition-bound space. But this wasn't just architectural rivalry, it was a taunt. Stuart's ceiling wasn't higher, it was audacious, a physical manifestation of her refusal to play by a store's rules. The old guard clutched their pearls, but the newly rich flocked to Stuart's events, reveling in the unspoken rebellion. Then Stuart struck the fatal blow. She scheduled her grand ball for the same night as a store's annual opera gala. The city held its breath. Would the 400 dare snub their queen? A store responded with icy precision. She leaked word that any guest who chose Stuart's event would find themselves permanently erased from her list. The threat worked initially. Dozens of social climbers bowed out of Stuart's ball, fearing exile. But Stuart, ever the tactician, pivoted. She filled her ballroom with artists, politicians, and a carefully selected coterie of European nobles who couldn't care less about a store's provincial power plays. The press crowed about the renegade soiree, and Stuart's guest list became a badge of honor for those brave enough to wear it. A store retaliated by weaponizing nostalgia. Her next events leaned hard into old money symbolism, exclusive, intimate, dripping with heritage. While Stuart's parties were spectacles, one featured a live reenactment of a Venetian carnival, complete with gondolas floating in a makeshift canal. Her stores were masterclasses in restraint. Her message was clear: flashy money could buy a crowd, but only pedigree could command respect. The turning point came when Stuart, in a stroke of malicious genius, hired away a store's longtime chef, the man responsible for her legendary terrapin soup. The defection made headlines, and a store's next dinner party suffered for it. But here's the twist: Stuart didn't even want the chef. She let him go after a month, having made her point. Power wasn't just about who had the best party favors. It was about proving you could dismantle your rival's traditions on a whim. Yet in the end, the war claimed them both. A store, though never unseated, grew rigid in her defense of the old order, her parties feeling more like museums than celebrations. Stuart, for all her bravado, burned too bright. Her fortune dwindled from relentless extravagance, and her later years were spent in Parisian exile, a cautionary tale. Their battle exposed the rot beneath Gilded Age glitter, how quickly alliances cracked when tested, how fragile supremacy really was, because the truth was, neither woman won. New York's spotlight simply moved on, leaving them to feud over scraps, while a new generation wrote their own rules. What made their clash legendary wasn't the outcome, it was the sheer pettiness of it all. This wasn't just about guest lists or soup recipes. It was about two women who understood, better than any king or general, that in the theater of high society, the smallest slight could be the deadliest weapon. And in that world, the throne room wasn't a place. It was wherever you dared to say, no to the wrong person. The Russian court had never witnessed a scandal quite like the night Baroness Mathilda von Rothschild was turned away from the Winter Palace ball. Picture the scene, her diamond tiara catching the lamplight, her worth gown worth more than most noble estates, and the Grand Marshal's gloved hand rising like a guillotine blade to block her path. "No Jews," came the icy explanation, though everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about religion, it was about fear. The Rothschilds' banking empire stretched across Europe, their loans propping up thrones, yet their names still couldn't buy entry to Alexander III's inner circle. But Mathilda didn't weep or retreat. She smiled, turned on her heel, and unleashed a social earthquake that would crack open the aristocracy's gilded cage. Within weeks, every Rothschild in Europe received a new directive: withdraw all lines of credit to the Romanovs, loans for military upgrades denied. Bailouts for faltering railroads impossible. Even petty cash for courtiers' gambling debts evaporated overnight. The Tsar's ministers scrambled as treasury reserves bled dry, but the message was clear: snub a Rothschild and you bankrupt your dynasty. Meanwhile, Mathilda hosted her own ball in Paris, where exiled Russian liberals toasted her with champagne, while Tsarist spies lurked impotently in the shadows. The guest list was a masterpiece of malice. Every family who'd ever feuded with the Romanovs, every artist who'd mocked them in print, even a few disgruntled Grand Dukes who'd learned the hard way that Rothschild gold spent better than imperial favors. Alexander's courtiers dismissed it as wealthy petulance until the whispers began. Rival monarchs, long jealous of Russia's reach, suddenly found their own Rothschild loans came with friendlier terms. Newspapers from London to Vienna spun the snub as proof of Romanov barbarism, eroding Russia's carefully cultivated image as Europe's guardian of tradition. The final humiliation came when Alexander's own cousin, the Duke of Leuchtenberg, publicly attended Mathilda's soiree, kissing her hand in full view of the press. The aristocracy's oldest rule, that bloodlines superseded wealth, was collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy, yet Mathilda's revenge had a darker edge. She didn't just break the rules, she exposed them by funding radical artists who caricatured the Tsar, bankrolling translations of banned books, even quietly subsidizing revolutionary students abroad. She turned cultural warfare into a Rothschild specialty. The family that had once bribed kings to gain acceptance now financed the very forces that would topple them. When Lenin's revolutionaries stormed the Winter Palace in 1917, they found vaults emptied by years of financial isolation, a decay the Rothschilds had helped accelerate. The Baroness's triumph wasn't personal vindication, it was proof that in the modern world, thrones no longer held a monopoly on power. A banker's ledger could be deadlier than a royal decree, and the right insult, delivered at the right moment, could unravel centuries of protocol. The Romanovs learned too late: you could bar a Rothschild from your ballroom, but you couldn't stop her from rewriting the rules of the game. Wallis Simpson's arrival into Edward VIII's life wasn't just a scandal, it was a detonation in the heart of the British Empire. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace, what began as whispered gossip between courtiers erupted into a full-blown constitutional crisis, with Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin delivering an ultimatum that would force the king to choose between the crown and the woman he loved. The private throne room confrontations were less debates than high-stakes games of chicken, where tradition and modernity crashed headlong into one another. Edward's obsession with Wallis defied every rule of royal decorum. While past monarchs had discreetly kept mistresses, he flaunted their relationship with breathtaking audacity, taking her on official tours, seating her at state banquets, even allowing her to redecorate his private quarters while his ministers seethed. By the autumn of 1936, Baldwin could no longer ignore the ticking time bomb. Summoning the king to a closed-door meeting, he laid bare the brutal reality: the empire would not tolerate a twice-divorced American queen. Edward, lounging with insolent ease in his armchair, countered with what he thought was a masterstroke, proposing a morganatic marriage, where Wally's would be his wife, but not his consort. Baldwin's response was glacial. The British public, he warned, would see it as a backdoor coronation for a woman they viewed as a gold-digging social climber. What made these confrontations so explosive was Edward's sheer dismissal of precedent. When Baldwin invoked the Church of England's opposition to divorce, the king scoffed, suggesting he'd simply remodel the church to suit his needs. As the Prime Minister cited warnings from Dominion leaders, Edward waved them off like bothersome flies. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was existential. He genuinely believed the monarchy could be reshaped by sheer force of will, that centuries of tradition would bend to his passion. Baldwin, usually a master of political theatre, found himself outmaneuvered not by strategy, but by the king's reckless sincerity. Then came the leak. Fleet Street editors, long suppressing the scandal at Baldwin's request, finally broke the story, and the empire erupted. Protesters outside Westminster chanted, "Give us our king." While bishops denounced Wally's as a modern-day Delilah, Edward, watching his support crumble, made one last desperate play. Summoning Baldwin to the palace at midnight, he begged for a radio address to plead his case directly to the people. The Prime Minister, sensing the monarchy's fragility, agreed, but with strings attached. The speech would be vetted, and no mention of morganatic marriage could be made. Edward's broadcast on December 11, 1936, was a masterpiece of self-destruction. His voice cracked as he uttered the fatal line, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." In that moment, he didn't just abdicate the throne, he shattered the myth of royal infallibility. The crown, once a sacred trust, was now a casualty of personal desire. Yet the real reckoning wasn't Edward's, it was the monarchy's. Baldwin had gambled that the institution was stronger than any one man, and he was right. George VI's steady reign would soon eclipse his brother's melodrama, proving that the throne room's true power lay not in passion, but in restraint. Edward got his fairy tale, but at a cost neither he nor Wally's anticipated: eternal exile, a life spent wandering between Parisian parties and palm-lined beaches, always watching from afar as the empire he'd abandoned marched on without him. The irony, Wally's never wanted to be queen. In private letters, she'd begged Edward to drop the idea, fearing the backlash, but the king, so desperate to prove his love, was more than a midlife rebellion, couldn't see the trap he'd built for them both. Their story wasn't a romance, it was a cautionary tale about what happens when the throne room's most dangerous adversary isn't a rival or a revolution, but the monarch's own unchecked heart. Grace Kelly sailed into Monaco like a Hollywood hurricane, only to find the palace gates bolted shut by tradition. The Grimaldi court, steeped in centuries of rigid protocol, viewed her as an exotic threat, an Oscar-winning actress with American independence written into every stride. Palace chamberlains shuddered at her rehearsed informality, her insistence on choosing her own wardrobe, even the way she dared to laugh too loudly in hallways built for whispers. The breaking point came during wedding preparations, when Kelly requested a simple civil ceremony before the grand Catholic affair. The old guard balked. For Monaco's aristocrats, this wasn't just about ritual, it was a test of whether their future princess would bend to their ways or drag their principality into modern disgrace. What happened next revealed the steel beneath Kelly's pearl-strung elegance. Summoning the palace's most resistant advisors, she didn't plead or charm. Instead, she dissected their objections with the precision of a director studying a script. the civil ceremony, a nod to her Protestant family's sensibilities. Her selective use of French protocol, not rejection but thoughtful adaptation, and when one baron sneered about American impulsiveness, she fixed him with the same icy gaze that had silenced camera crews on Hitchcock sets. "I assure you," she murmured, "impulse has nothing to do with it." The room stilled. Here was no starlet-playing princess, this was a woman who'd commanded million-dollar film sets and negotiated with studio heads twice as intimidating as any minor noble. The real masterstroke came when Kelly turned Monaco's greatest weakness into her leverage. The principality's fading glamour needed her star power as much as she needed its title. While critics whispered about her past films, she orchestrated a photo op that would rewrite the narrative, touring Monaco's hospitals, speaking flawless French to patients, her empathy as authentic as her diamonds. The press swooned. Overnight, public opinion flipped. Now it was the palace's stuffy traditionalists who seemed out of touch, clinging to mothballed customs while their future princess charmed the world. By the wedding day, even her staunchest opponents had surrendered. When Kelly processed down the cathedral aisle, her posture betrayed none of the backstage battles, only the serene confidence of someone who'd won the war without firing a shot. The lesson was clear. Hollywood had trained her for this role better than any royal finishing school. In a world where queens were born, not made, Grace Kelly proved that sometimes the best royalty are the ones who have studied the part. Diana's 1995 BBC interview wasn't just a television appearance, it was a precision strike against the monarchy's centuries-old fortress of silence. Sitting in Kensington Palace's muted drawing room, dressed in a deceptively simple black blazer, she dismantled the royal playbook with every carefully chosen word. When Martin Bashir asked about Camilla Parker Bowles, Diana didn't deflect or demur. Her response, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," detonated across the airwaves with the force of a howitzer shell. Here was no carefully vetted palace statement, no diplomatic half-truths. This was a princess turning her personal devastation into a weapon that left the institution gasping. The brilliance of Diana's attack lay in its framing. She spoke softly, her voice occasionally trembling, performing the role of wounded wife while skewering the system that failed her. Each revelation, Charles's infidelity, her own bulimia, the palace's indifference was wrapped in vulnerability, making counterattacks impossible without looking brutish. The Queen's advisors, masters of managing scandals behind gilded doors, found themselves outmatched by a televised confessional that reached millions directly. While Buckingham Palace still communicated through stiffly worded press releases, Diana had harnessed the most subversive tool of the modern age, raw, unfiltered empathy. Her confession about self-harm was particularly devastating. Royalty wasn't supposed to admit fragility, yet here was the Princess of Wales describing how she'd cut herself with a lemon slicer, how she'd thrown herself downstairs while pregnant. These weren't the struggles of some distant aristocrat, they were painfully human, instantly relatable to anyone who'd ever felt trapped or desperate. The monarchy, built on mythic perfection, suddenly seemed cold and cruel by contrast, but the interview's true coup was its timing, with Charles's damning Tampingate tapes still fresh in public memory. Diana positioned herself not as a rebel, but as a truth-teller. When she mused that Charles might not be fit to be king, it wasn't presented as bitterness, it was framed as concern for the institution itself. She painted her battles not as personal vendettas, but as fights for her son's emotional survival. Even her iconic Queen of Hearts line, delivered with a wistful smile, reframed her humanitarian work as what royalty should be, casting the Windsor's formality as outdated. The fallout was catastrophic for the crown. Palace lawyers scrambled to redraft divorce terms, terrified she'd reveal more. Tabloids that once hounded Diana now turned their fury on Charles and Camilla. Most damning of all, public support for abolishing the monarchy briefly spiked to 25%. Diana had done what no politician or rival dynasty ever could. She'd made people question whether the throne deserved to exist at all. Yet the interview's greatest irony was how traditional her weapons really were. Like Elizabeth I wielding her virginity as political armor, or Marie Antoinette's disastrous, let-them-eat-cake moment, Diana understood that royal power lives and dies by public perception. She simply updated the playbook for the television age, trading throne rooms for living rooms, heraldic proclamations for prime-time confessionals. The monarchy survived, of course, but never again would it pretend that palace walls could contain the truths simmering behind them. Diana proved that in the modern world, the most dangerous throne room confrontations don't happen under crystal chandeliers. They happen on screen, in pixels and sound bites, where a single interview can shake an empire. The 21st century throne room looks nothing like its gilded ancestors, no jeweled scepters, no velvet kneeling cushions, but the battles raging within its walls are just as brutal. Take King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, whose carefully cultivated image as the people's king shattered during the COVID pandemic. When lockdown protests turned violent in 2021, cameras caught him snarling at a waterlogged demonstrator, "Idiot, you're ruining everything." The clip went viral, not because monarchs never lose their temper, but because it exposed the raw friction between modern royalty's performative empathy and the reality of ruling an angry, divided nation. Willem-Alexander's subsequent apology to awkward YouTube videos, strained smiles at hospital visits, only highlighted the impossible tightrope walk. Today's monarchs must seem relatable enough to justify their existence, but never so human they appear ordinary. Spain's Juan Carlos learned this lesson the hard way. Once celebrated for steering Spain to democracy, his final years as king resembled a telenovela gone rogue. When corruption allegations exploded in 2014, luxury safaris funded by Middle Eastern bribes, secret Swiss accounts stashed with millions, he didn't face the music. He fled to Abu Dhabi, leaving his son to clean up the wreckage. The throne room confrontation here wasn't with protesters or politicians, but with history itself. Juan Carlos' exile proved that in the age of smartphones and transparency, scandals don't just tarnish a reputation, they rewrite an entire legacy, yet the most revealing modern clashes aren't always the loudest. Denmark's Queen Margrethe II stunned the world in 2022 by stripping 4 grandchildren of their royal titles, a move framed as streamlining the monarchy. But behind palace walls, this was a grenade lobbed at her son Prince Joachim's strained marriage and his children's increasingly erratic public behavior. No fiery speeches, no slammed doors, just a Chinese letter press release that severed centuries of tradition with bureaucratic ease. The real power play, forcing the family's dirty laundry into the open while positioning herself as the pragmatic steward of the crown's survival. Even Britain's royals, masters of the dignified silence, couldn't escape the storm. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's opera interview wasn't just a tell-all, it was a direct assault on the throne room's most sacred rule: never let them see you sweat. When Meghan described begging for mental health help only to be denied, and Harry confessed his father, "Stop taking my calls," they didn't just air private grievances. They exposed the institution's rot the way it consumes individuals to preserve itself. The Queen's famously terse response, "Recollections may vary," was a masterpiece of deflection, but the damage was done. Modern audiences don't want enigmatic sound bites. They want accountability. What makes these contemporary confrontations so explosive is their asymmetry. Monarchs today wield little real power, yet they're held to higher standards than ever. A Dutch king's road rage, a Spanish king's greed, even a Danish queen's family feud. Each misstep fuels existential debates about whether crowns deserve to exist at all. The throne room's walls may be virtual now, but the battles within them still determine who keeps their head figuratively this time. And absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it twists the very way rulers perceive reality, turning even the slightest dissent into existential threats. At the heart of every royal explosion lies a brutal paradox. The more control a monarch wields, the more fragile they feel. Picture Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, who transformed Versailles into a gilded prison for his nobles. His infamous rages weren't just about ego, they were survival tactics. By keeping the aristocracy scrambling for his favor, he preempted any challenge to his authority. The psychology here is primal. When your identity is fused with divine right, any disobedience feels like a crack in the universe itself. That's why Henry VIII's court became a slaughterhouse of fallen favorites. Every raised eyebrow, every whispered joke carried the ghost of rebellion. But not all rulers reacted to pressure with fury. Elizabeth I weaponized silence, letting her unreadable stare do the work of an executioner's axe. The difference, control. Elizabeth, who'd survived her sister Mary's reign and a youth of shifting alliances, understood that unpredictability was her armor. Her temper, when it flashed, was never impulsive. It was theater, carefully staged to reinforce her invincibility. Compare that to Wilhelm II of Germany, whose outbursts were pure insecurity. His crippled arm, a source of lifelong shame, fueled his need to dominate every conversation, every negotiation. Where Elizabeth's anger was calculated, Wilhelm's was a leaking wound, exposing the fragility beneath his saber-rattling bravado. The terror of losing status could be even more volatile than the hunger for power. Marie Antoinette's alleged, "let them eat cake," wasn't just callous, it was the panic of someone who'd never been told no. Sheltered in the Versailles bubble, she'd been taught that her mere existence justified luxury. When famine struck and the mobs roared, her confusion was genuine. How could they not adore her? That disconnect between royal self-perception and public reality turned her blind spot into a death sentence. Meanwhile, Catherine the Great, an outsider who seized Russia's throne, had no such illusions. Her rages were strategic, like the time she crushed a rebellion by personally riding into battle, her calm demeanor afterwards signaling not mercy, but absolute dominance. She knew power wasn't innate, it was performed. Why did some rulers thrive on confrontation while others unraveled? Look at their upbringing. Monarchs raised with relentless scrutiny, like Victoria, drilled from birth in duty and restraint often internalized their rage as passive aggression. Those who ascended abruptly, like Napoleon, swung between megalomania and desperation, their outbursts mirroring their imposter syndrome, and then there were the survivors. Maria Theresa of Austria, thrust onto the throne at 23, channeled her fury into endurance, outlasting Frederick the Great not with tantrums, but with sheer stamina. Her rage was cold, slow burning, the kind that builds dynasties rather than burning them down. Ultimately, royal anger was never just emotion, it was currency, theater, and weaponry fused into one. The moment a ruler's outburst stopped working, when courtiers no longer trembled, when the public scoffed instead of cowering, was the moment their power began to bleed away. The throne room's darkest truth: fear might crown kings, but only self-control could keep them there. Protocol wasn't just about manners, it was a minefield, and the monarchs who laid the traps knew exactly how to watch their enemies stumble. Louis XIV didn't invent court etiquette to make life orderly. He weaponized it, turning every bow, every gesture, even the timing of a cough into potential treason. Picture this: a nobleman, desperate for favor, arrives 5 minutes early to the king's morning levee, only to find the doors locked. Another lingers too long after being dismissed, and suddenly his son's military promotion evaporates. These weren't oversights, they were executions in silk gloves. Louis' genius was making humiliation feel like tradition, so his victims blamed themselves rather than the system. And the system, it was designed to keep them too busy scrambling for trivial privileges like the honor of handing the king his shirt to ever plot against him. Victoria perfected a subtler form of this cruelty. Where Louis ruled through spectacle, she governed with glacial silence. Her infamous drawing room stares could dismantle a minister's career without her uttering a word. The trick was in the details. A guest seated too close to her at dinner signaled favor, seated too far, and their political influence withered by morning. When Disraeli once dared to reference her late husband Albert in a speech, a subject she guarded like a sacred relic, she didn't reprimand him. She simply stopped inviting him to private audiences for months, letting the snub ripple through Parliament like a chill. The message was clear: cross an invisible line, and the Queen's displeasure would follow you like a shadow. The brilliance of protocol as punishment lay in its deniability. No edicts needed to be signed, no dungeons required. A single raised eyebrow during a state banquet could brand a diplomat as incompetent, while an overeager duchess might find her family excluded from the next season's events for the crime of wearing the wrong shade of mauve. These weren't petty slights, they were calculated strikes at reputation, the currency of power. When Nicholas II of Russia visited England and unknowingly used a fork reserved for dessert, Victoria didn't correct him. She let the gaffe hang in the air, her attendants exchanging glances that would fuel gossip for weeks. The Tsar left red-faced, his authority subtly undermined over something as trivial as cutlery. Even children weren't spared the game. Young Princess Alice of Hesse, Victoria's daughter, once forgot to curtsy deeply enough to a visiting archduke. The Queen didn't scold her in private. She forced Alice to repeat the gesture repeatedly in front of the entire court until tears welled in the girl's eyes. The lesson: loyalty wasn't instinct, it was muscle memory, beaten into the body until defiance became physically painful. Yet the darkest irony was how eagerly the aristocracy played along. They penned exhaustive manuals on proper fan gestures, agonized over the precise angle of a bow, and bankrupted themselves for wardrobes that changed hourly to meet royal whims. In doing so, they became complicit in their own subjugation. Louis and Victoria didn't just enforce the rules, they made their courtiers enforce them on each other, turning every social interaction into a silent battleground. The throne room's quietest truth: the most effective chains aren't made of iron, they're woven from the desperate human need to belong. Catherine de Medici didn't just rule France, she weaponized silence better than any army. Arriving in a foreign court as a teenage bride, surrounded by sneering nobles who dismissed her as a merchant's daughter, she learned early that words were bullets best loaded in private. When her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, flaunted her influence by wearing the crown jewels, Catherine didn't protest, she waited, for years. Then, the moment Henry II died in a jousting accident, she struck without uttering a single threat. Diane was ordered to surrender every gift the king had given her down to the last silver spoon, and exiled to a crumbling chateau. The lesson: true power isn't screaming your vengeance. It's letting your enemies hear their own heartbeat in the pause before you ruin them. Maria Theresa of Austria took a different approach, overwhelming force disguised as maternal warmth. Facing Frederick the Great's invasion, she didn't just rally troops, she weaponized motherhood. Addressing the Hungarian Diet while heavily pregnant, her belly a visible symbol of the dynasty under threat, she flipped their loyalty with a single line delivered through tears. I place in your hands the daughter of your kings and her unborn child." The room erupted in cheers, swords drawn in allegiance. Here was the genius of her rhetoric. She framed her desperation not as weakness, but as sacred duty. Even her letters to Frederick, dripping with faux concern for my brother's misguided ambitions, painted him as the aggressor violating a mother's peace. By the war's end, though she lost Silesia, she'd won something more valuable, the myth of Maria Theresa as Europe's indomitable matriarch. Then there was Christina of Sweden, the queen who turned abdication into a mic drop. When her conversion to Catholicism made her throne untenable, she didn't slink away under cover of night. She staged a farewell spectacle in the Senate, declaring, "I would rather rule myself than a kingdom," before tossing her crown onto the assembly floor. The shockwave reverberated across Europe, a monarch voluntarily surrendering power, yet somehow emerging more legendary than ever. Her post-throne life in Rome became a performance of eccentric defiance, hosting philosophers in breeches, commissioning portraits of herself as Minerva, even nominating herself for Pope. Christina understood what few rulers dared admit sometimes. The ultimate power move is walking away and leaving them gossiping forever. Across the Atlantic, Alva Belmont rewrote the playbook entirely. When her husband left her for a younger woman, she didn't retreat to the shadows. She orchestrated the divorce trial of the century, leaking his love letters to the press with timed precision. Reporters dubbed it the Vanderbilt War, but Alva was always 3 steps ahead. She turned her victimhood into leverage, negotiating a settlement so vast it made her one of America's richest women, then funneled the money into suffrage marches. Her genius, recognizing that in the Gilded Age, newspapers were the new throne rooms, and ink was deadlier than any dagger. These women shared a common tactic. They knew the rules well enough to break them gloriously. Catherine leveraged etiquette as a garrote. Maria Theresa wielded maternity like a broadsword. Christina treated her crown as a prop in a grander narrative. And Alva, she proved that in a world where men held legal power, the real battles were fought in salons, courtrooms, and society columns. Their victories weren't just personal. They rewrote what power could look like when wielded with creativity and nerve. The throne room might have been built by men, but history remembers the women who turned its rituals into revolutions. Throne room confrontations didn't just decide fates, they unraveled lives with the ruthlessness of a guillotine's drop. For every monarch who emerged victorious, there were dozens left broken in the shadows, courtiers stripped of titles, heirs banished to mouldering estates, and once proud nobles reduced to begging for scraps at the tables of their enemies. Take the Duke of Buckingham, once James I's most beloved favourite. His fatal mistake, underestimating the quiet fury of a neglected queen. When Anne of Denmark's resentment festered into a whispering campaign, Buckingham's enemies pounced. Accused of witchcraft and treason, he died bleeding on a Portsmouth tavern floor, stabbed by a disgruntled officer. His family's estates were confiscated, their names scrubbed from royal records like a stain. The throne room giveth, and the throne room taketh away, often with interest. Exile was the slow death of the aristocracy. Lady Randolph Churchill, mother of Winston, learned this the hard way after her scandalous remarriage to a man 20 years her junior. Queen Victoria's disapproval wasn't just personal, it was professional. Overnight, invitations to court dried up, diplomats crossed ballrooms to avoid her, and her once lucrative political salons became ghost towns. For a woman whose influence relied on access, banishment from the throne room was a financial death sentence. She spent her final years in genteel poverty, writing desperate letters to the son who'd eclipsed her in fame. Then there were the heiresses who paid for rebellion with their fortunes. Consuelo Vanderbilt's divorce from the Duke of Marlborough cost her more than a title, it severed her from the Vanderbilt millions. leaving her reliant on a modest allowance. But the cruelest twist, her mother Alva, who'd orchestrated the marriage, disinherited her for leaving it, yet Consulo's story had an unexpected coda. Freed from gilded oppression, she became a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, turning her drawing room into a war room for equality. The throne room had exiled her, but in the streets of London and New York, she found a louder microphone. Not all casualties were so visible. The Comte de Vergennes, Louis XVI's foreign minister, died not by blade or decree, but by the sheer strain of navigating the Queen's feuds. Caught between Marie Antoinette's Austrian loyalists and revolutionary factions, his health shattered under endless backroom battles. His final act, a frantic memo warning the king of impending disaster, ignored of course. Vergennes' heart gave out months before the Bastille fell, sparing him the guillotine, but cementing his legacy as collateral damage in a war of egos. The darkest irony, some survivors wished they hadn't. Princess Louise of Belgium, trapped in a loveless marriage to a Habsburg archduke, watched her reputation implode after a rumored affair with a military tutor. Though never proven, the scandal clung like perfume in a sealed room. Her husband exiled her to a remote island, where she rotted for decades, writing poetry about the sea, as her family pretended she'd never existed. When she finally died, her obituaries reduced her to a footnote in her brother Leopold's reign. The throne room's cruelty wasn't always swift. Sometimes it was the slow erosion of a name, a legacy, a personhood. Yet from the wreckage, a few carved new kingdoms. Theda Bara, Hollywood's original vamp, was born Theodosia Goodman, daughter of a Jewish tailor whose family fled pogroms in Poland. When antisemitism barred her from high society, she reinvented herself as an Egyptian mystic's love child, dripping in faux exoticism. Studio publicists fed the lie, spinning tales of her Arabian heritage until even critics bought it. By the time the Rus collapsed, she didn't need it. She'd already seduced America. The throne room had cast her out, so she built her own in celluloid and coal. These weren't just personal tragedies. They were proof that in the Game of Thrones, even the winners bore scars. For every Elizabeth I who ruled untouched, there were 100 souls ground beneath the wheels of dynastic ambition. Some, like Consulo and Theda, turned exile into reinvention. Others became cautionary tales, whispered over brandy in rooms they'd never enter again. But all shared one unshakable truth. Once the throne room marked you, its shadow never truly faded whether you wore a crown or ashes. The battles fought in gilded throne rooms centuries ago never truly disappeared. They just traded crowns for corner offices. Today's corporate clashes and political takedowns play out with startlingly familiar tactics, proving that while the scenery has changed, the rules of power remain ruthlessly the same. Take the modern equivalent of Louis XIV's exile strategy, silencing dissent by relegating critics to irrelevance. Tech giants have mastered this playbook, sidelining whistleblowers not with dungeon walls, but with non-disclosure agreements and career blacklisting. When a Google engineer publicly questioned AI ethics in 2017, he wasn't beheaded. He was reassigned to a windowless basement role until he quit. The message, disloyalty won't cost you your life, but it will cost your LinkedIn connections. Political resignations have also become carefully staged productions worthy of any royal abdication. Compare Edward VIII's tearful radio address with a modern prime minister's voluntary departure after a scandal. Both scripts follow the same arc: the illusion of choice, the noble sacrifice for stability, the hastily arranged photo op with a loyal successor. When Britain's Boris Johnson finally bowed to party pressure in 2022, his farewell speech in Downing Street's courtyard might as well have been Henry VIII's throne room, complete with forced smiles and unspoken threats about what might leak if anyone pushed too hard post-exit. Then there's the Catherine de Medici approach, using silence as a scalpel. Apple's legendary secrecy under Steve Jobs wasn't just about product launches, it was psychological warfare. By refusing to acknowledge rumors or competitors, Jobs turned Apple's keynotes into modern-day court appearances, where a single omitted feature could crash a rival's stock. Meanwhile, politicians like Germany's Angela Merkel wielded strategic muteness during crises, letting opponents exhaust themselves in speculation before delivering a single, devastating statement. Just as Renaissance queens knew uncontrolled words were weapons turned against you, today's CEOs and chancellors understand that in the age of viral soundbites, the most powerful voice is often the one withheld. Even royal extravagance has its corporate counterpart. Elon Musk's $4 billion Twitter rebrand to X mirrors Louis XIV's Versailles renovations, a flex so ostentatious it dares critics to question its necessity. Both were power plays disguised as aesthetic choices. Versailles' Hall of Mirrors reflected the Sun King's omnipresence, while X's obliteration of the bird logo signaled Musk's absolute control. The risk, just as Louis' spending bred resentment that fueled revolution, Musk's whims have turned platform updates into shareholder revolts, but perhaps the most chilling parallel is the modern purge. When Disney fired CEO Bob Chapek after just 18 months, the board didn't need executioners. They had severance packages and press leaks painting him as incompetent. The effect was identical to Tudor court coups: assets frozen, or in this case, stock options voided, allies quietly distancing themselves, and history rewritten overnight. Meanwhile, political parties conduct their own versions of medieval excommunications, with cancelled figures becoming unpersons in their own circles until they issue the requisite public penance. The key difference: today's players lack the luxury of divine right. A king could survive being hated. A CEO or president needs at least the illusion of popular support. That's why modern power brokers have refined the art of plausible deniability, outsourcing their dirty work to PR teams, algorithms, or junior executives who will take the fall. When Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg faced congressional grilling over data scandals, his rehearsed blank stare and robotic delivery were less a display of confusion than a calculated defense. The emperor's new algorithms were too complex for mere senators to understand. Yet some traditions are best left in the past. The corporate world has yet to replicate the throne room's bloodiest rituals, though certain hostile takeovers come close. When activist investors swarm a struggling company like vultures, their boardroom battles feature proxy fights instead of poison-tipped daggers, but the stakes are just as deadly for careers and legacies. And just as monarchs once married for alliances, today's mergers are sealed with handshakes and stock swaps rather than wedding vows, though the prenups are arguably more brutal. What these parallels reveal isn't just historical curiosity, it's a warning. The same tactics that toppled dynasties can still sink empires built on data instead of land. Hubris, isolation, and the belief that rules don't apply to the anointed few remain the Achilles heels of power. The modern lesson: whether you're wearing a crown or a hoodie, the moment you stop hearing dissent is the moment your throne, or CEO chair, starts crumbling beneath you. What keeps us riveted to these throne room clashes centuries later isn't just the glittering crowns or the venomous whispers, it's the unmistakable crack of humanity breaking through the facade of power. Every outburst, every calculated silence, every tear-stained betrayal exposes a truth we instinctively recognize. Beneath the ermine robes and inherited titles, these were people flawed, desperate, and startlingly relatable. When Elizabeth I's voice trembled signing Essex's death warrant, or when Diana stared down the camera and called her marriage a crowded room, we weren't just witnessing history. We were seeing our own battles reflected in palace mirrors, the insecurities, the heartbreaks, the moments we too have bitten back rage or weaponized silence. The real magic of these confrontations lies in their duality. They're both utterly alien and deeply familiar. We'll never know what it's like to command armies with a raised hand or face exile for a misplaced fork, but we do know the sting of betrayal, the burn of humiliation, the intoxicating rush of standing your ground. That's why Maria Theresa's defiance against Frederick the Great still electrifies us, or why Alva Belmont's revenge resonates like a modern-day corporate takedown. These stories endure because they strip away the mythos of monarchy, revealing the same raw nerves that throb in office boardrooms and family dinners. But perhaps the most startling revelation is how often these rulers knew they were performing. Louis XIV's Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a stage where every glance was choreographed, every tantrum calibrated. Centuries later, Diana and Meghan Markle would harness that same theatricality for the television age, trading gilded halls for talk show couches. The mediums change, but the game doesn't. Power survives when it convinces us it's both untouchable and just like us. So who mastered this high wire act best? Was it Catherine the Great, who turned a coup into a coronation, or Victoria, whose glacial stares could dismantle empires? Maybe it's Consuelo Vanderbilt, who transformed her gilded cage into a megaphone for women's rights. Drop your pick in the comments, and while you're there, tell us which modern showdowns deserve their place in the Throne Room Hall of Fame. After all, the next great confrontation might be playing out right now in a CEO's office or a celebrity feud, and history will be watching.